Let's look at our first set of problems. We're going to multiply -6 times -2. Now remember, the rules for multiplying and dividing is a lot easier than for adding and subtracting. All you have to remember is the following. Count the number of negative signs. If there's an even number, the product is positive. If there's an odd number, the product is negative. 1, 2, negative signs. 2 is an even number, so that tells us that the product is going to be positive. So we'll put a plus sign here to remind us. Then just multiply as usual. 6 times 2 is 12. So -2 times -6 times -2 is a positive 12. Again, let me repeat the rule one more time. When multiplying and dividing sign numbers, count the number of negative signs. If there's an even number, the product is positive. If there's an odd number, the product is negative. Let's look at our second problem here. We're going to multiply two fractions. Let's get the sign out of the way. 1 negative sign. 1's an odd number. That tells us that our final product will be negative. Now we just multiply as usual. Multiplying our two fractions. Remember, to multiply fractions, we multiply the two numbers together in the numerator and then in the denominator. 3 times 2 is 6. In our denominator, 5 times 7 is 35. So the product of -3/5 and -2/7, -3/5 and +2/7 is -6/35. Our last product here. We have a +40 times a -20. Again, count the number of negative signs. There's only 1. 1's an odd number. That tells us that our product's going to be negative. Now we multiply as usual. 40 times 20. Remember, an easy way to multiply large numbers like this is to first of all multiply the two digits 4 times 2. Product 8. Count the number of zeros. 1, 2. Add them. 40 times -20 gives us a product of -800. So once again, the most important rule to remember when multiplying these sign numbers is count the number of negative signs. If there's an even number, the product is positive. If there's an odd number, the product is negative. Let's take a look at what we have next. Determine the sign of the product, and let's also just write the product for our own reference. Remember, the rule is simple. Count the number of negative signs. If there's an even number of negative signs, the entire product is positive. If there's an odd number of negative signs, the product is negative. Let's look at our first product. Let's count the number of negative signs. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4, an even number. That tells us the entire product will be positive. So let's write that out to remind us. Remember, we don't have to write the positive sign when the number is positive, but we're just doing this to keep a note for ourselves. Now let's multiply the numbers together. 2 times 3 is 6, times 4 is 24, times 1 is 24. So our final product is +24. Let's look at our second string of numbers. We have -1 times -3 times -2. Again, count the number of negative signs. 1, 2, 3. 3 is an odd number. That tells us that a product will be negative. Let's write that down. Negative. The rest of it's easy. We'll just multiply the numbers together as usual. 1 times 3 is 3, times 2 is 6. So the final product we have is -6. So again, don't forget, simply count the number of negative signs. If there's an even number, the product is positive. If there's an odd number, the product is negative. Now let's look at dividing real numbers. We're going to divide the following. Now, the one thing great about dividing real numbers is this. You don't have to learn another rule. The rule for dividing real numbers is exactly the same as for multiplying real numbers, and that is this. To divide real numbers, just count the number of negative signs. If there's an odd number, the division or the quotient is negative. If there's an even number, then we have a positive. So let's count. We're going to divide negative 36 divided by negative 2. Count the number of signs. 1, 2. This tells us that our quotient will be positive. We divide as usual. 36 divided by 2 is 18. So, negative 36 divided by negative 2 gives us positive 18. Let's look at the one right below. Remember that when we see a fraction bar, that represents the operation of division. So this really means 50 divided by negative 10. Again, count the number of negative signs. 1. 1's an odd number. That tells us that the quotient will be negative. 50 divided by 10 is 5. So this tells us then that 50 divided by negative 10 is equal to a negative 5. Let's look at some other problems. We're going to divide these interesting looking problems. Now the first one here has 7/8, and remember the fraction bar means to divide. So it's 7/8 divided by negative 21. Now what we can do to possibly simplify what we're looking at is to rewrite the problem horizontally. So we can rewrite this as 7/8 divided by, and we have negative 21. Now remember that negative 21, if we want to write it as a fraction, is negative 21 over 1. So now it's not so bad. We go back to our regular division rules, which is count the number of negative signs. In this case, there's 1. So we know that the end quotient will be negative. But let's go back and we have to review how to multiply fractions. If you'll recall, to multiply fractions, all we have to do is multiply by the reciprocal of our second fraction here. So this becomes 7/8 times negative 1 over 21. Just flipping that over, and of course keeping the negative sign there. Now if you remember from working with fractions, what we can do to simplify our multiplication is we can reduce common factors. I see a 7 in the numerator and a 21 down in the denominator. 7 and 21 have a common factor of 7. 7 and a 7 once, 7 and a 21 3 times. That makes it a lot simpler. So now we're left with multiplying 1 times 1 in the numerator, which is 1, and 8 times 3, which is 24, in our denominator. Again, don't forget the sign. We determined up front here that since there was one negative sign, our final quotient would be negative. So that gives us a negative 1 over 24. Let's try that again. I know these are a little bit tricky. Let's look at our second problem. We've got negative 2/3 divided by negative 7/13. Let's determine up front here that we have two negative signs, 2, an even number. That tells us that our quotient will be positive. So again, what we'll do is we'll rewrite our fraction in horizontal fashion. We have negative 2/3. This, remember, just means divide. The denominator, negative 7/13. Again, we have to review division of fractions, which means just to multiply by the reciprocal of our second fraction. So we have negative 2/3 times, and the reciprocal means just to flip over that fraction. So 7/13 becomes 13/7. And remember, that second number was negative as well. So again, we determined up front that our quotient was going to be positive since there are two negative signs. So let's write that down as a plus. And then we'll multiply as usual. Now let's check to see if there are any common factors. In this case, there are not. So we'll just multiply numerators and denominators together. 2 times 13 is 26. 3 times 7 is 21. So our final quotient for this pretty fancy looking fraction is 26 over 21.